Section 13 of The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Vera. The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen by Elizabeth von Arnim. The Ninth Day. From Glowe to Wiek. The landlord was concerned, Gertrude told me, when he heard we were going to drive to Arkona at an hour in the morning, known practically only to birds. Professor Nieberlein, after fuming long and audibly in the passage downstairs, had sent her up with a request, made in his hearing, that the carriage might be at the door for that purpose at 4 o'clock. At that hour there is no door, said the landlord. Tut, tut, said the professor. The landlord raised his hands and described the length and sandiness of the way. 3 o'clock, then, was all the professor said to that, calling after Gertrude. Oh, oh, was my eloquent exclamation when she came in and told me, and I pulled the bedclothes up still higher, as though seeking protection in them from the blows of fate. It is possible August might oversleep himself, suggested Gertrude, seeing my speechless objection to starting for anywhere at 3 o'clock. So it is. I think it very likely, I said, emerging from the bedclothes to speak earnestly. Till 6 o'clock, I should think he would sleep, at least till 6. Should not you, Gertrude? It is very probable, said Gertrude, and went away to give the order. August did. He slept so heavily that 8 o'clock found the professor and myself still at Glowe, breakfasting at a little table in the road before the house on flounders and hot gooseberry jam. The professor was much calmer, quite composed in fact, and liked the flounders, which he said were as fresh as young love. He had been very tired after his long day and the previous sleepless night, and when he found I was immovable he too had gone to bed and overslept himself. Immediately on seeing him in the morning I told him what I felt sure was true, that Charlotte, knowing I would come to Arkona in the course of my drive round the coast, had gone on there to wait for me. So there is really no hurry, I added. Hurry? Certainly not, he said, gay and reasonable after his good night. We will enjoy the present, little cousin, and the admirable flounders. And he told me the story of the boastful man who had wanted the loftiness of his rooms to a man poorer than himself, except in wit. And the poorer man, weary of this talk of ceilings, was goaded at last to relate how in his own house the rooms were so low that the only things he could ever have for meals were flounders. And though I had heard the story before, I took care to exhibit a decent mirth in the proper place, ending by laughing with all my heart, only to see how the professor laughed and wiped his eyes. It was a close day of sunless heat. The sky was an intolerable grey glare. There was no wind, and the flies buzzed in swarms about the horses' heads as we drove along the straight white road between the pines towards Arkona. Gertrude was once more relegated to a cart, but she did not look nearly so grim as before. She obviously preferred the professor to his wife, which was a lapse from the normal discretion of her manners. Gertrude's not being supposed to have preferences, and certainly none that are obvious. From Glowe, the high road goes through the pines, almost without a bend to the next place, Julius Rue, about an hour and a half north of Glowe. We did not pass a single house. The way was absolutely lonely and its stuffiness dreadful. We could see neither the Baltic nor the Bodden, though both were only a few yards off on the other side of the pines. At Julius Rue, a flat, airless place of new lodging houses, we did get a glimpse of a mud-coloured sea, and after Julius Rue, the high road and the pines abruptly ending, we got into the open country of whose sandiness the Glowe landlord had spoken with uplifted hands. As we labored along at a walking pace, the grayness of the sky grew denser, and it began to rain. This was the first rain I had had during my journey, and it was delicious. The ripe corn on our left looked a deeper gold against the dull sky. The ditches were like streaks of light. They were so crammed with yellow flowers. The air grew fragrant with wetness, and, best of all, the dust left off. The professor put up his umbrella, which turned out to be so enormous when open that we could both sit comfortably under it and keep dry, and he was in such good spirits at being fairly on Charlotte's tracks that I am inclined to think it was the most agreeable drive I had had in Rügen. The traveller, however, who does not sit under one umbrella with a pleased professor on the way to Arkona must not suppose that he too will like this bit best, for he will not. The road turns off sharply inland at Wiet, a tiny fisher hamlet we came upon unexpectedly, hidden in a deep cleft. It is a charming little place, a few fishermen's huts, a minute inn, and a great many walnut trees. Passing along the upper end of the cleft, we looked straight down its one shingly street to the sea, washing among rocks. Big black fisher boats were hauled up among into the street itself. The forlorn artist's umbrella stood all alone halfway down, sheltering an unfinished painting from the gentle rain, while the artist, I supposed him to be the artist because of his unique neck arrangements, watched it wistfully from the inn door. As wit, even in rain, was perfectly charming, I can confidently recommend it to the traveller, for on a sunny day it must be quite one of the prettiest spots in Rügen. If I had been alone, I would certainly have stayed there at least one night, though the inn looked as if its beds were feather and its butter bad. But I now had a mission, and he who has a mission spends most of his time passing the best things by. Is not that a little paradise? I exclaimed. The professor quoted Dr. Johnson and Charles Lamb, remarking that he understood their taste better than that of those persons who indulge in ill-defined and windy raptures about scenery and the weather. But we cannot all have the taste of great scholars, I said rather coldly, for I did not like the expression windy raptures. If thou meanest me by great scholars, thou, female babe, know that my years and poor rudiments of learning have served only to make it clear to me that the best things in life are of the class to which sitting under one umbrella with a dear little cousin belong. I endeavoured yesterday to impress this result of experience on the long Englishman, but he is still knee-deep in theories and cannot yet see the simple and the close at hand. I don't care one little bit for the umbrella form of joy, I said obstinately. It is the blankest dullness compared to the joy to be extracted from looking at a place like Wits in fine weather. Tut, tut, said the professor, talk not to me of weather. Thou dost not mean it from thy heart. And he arranged the rug afresh round me so that I should not get wet, and inquired solicitously why I did not wear a waterproof cloak like his, which was so very practical. From Witt the road to Arkona describes a triangle of which the village of Puttgarden is the apex. The round which it took us half an hour to drive, we got to Arkona, which consists solely of a lighthouse with an inn in it, about 1. "Now for the little lot!" cried the professor, leaping out into the rain and hastening towards the emerging landlord, while I hurriedly rehearsed the main points of my arguments. But Charlotta was not there. She had been there, the landlord said, the previous afternoon, having arrived by steamer, had asked for a bedroom, been shown one, but had wanted better accommodation than he could give. Anyhow, after drinking coffee, she had hired a conveyance and had gone on to Wiek. The professor was terribly crestfallen. "We will go on then," he said. "We will at once proceed to Wiek. Where Wiek is, I conclude we shall ultimately discover. I know where it is. It's on the map. I never doubted it. I mean, I know the way from here. I was going there anyhow, and Charlotta knew that. But we can't go on yet, dear Professor. The horses would never get us there. It must be at least 10 miles off, and awful sand the whole way." It took me some time and many words to convince him that nothing would make me move till the horses had had a feed and a rest. "We will only stay here a few hours," I comforted, "and get to Wiek anyhow to day." "But who can tell whether she will be there 2 nights running?" cried the professor, excitedly striding about in the mud. "Why, we can, when we get there, and it's no use bothering till we are there. But I'm sure she will wait till I come. Let us go in out of the rain." "I will hire a cart," he announced with great determination. "What, and go on without me? I tell thee I will hire a cart. No time shall be lost." And he ran back again to the landlord, who was watching us from the door with much disapproval. For I suppose Charlotta's refusal to consider his accommodation worthy of her had not disposed him well towards her friends, and possibly he considered the professor's rapid movements among the puddles too unaccountable to be nice. There was no cart, he said, absolutely none, and the professor, in a state of fuming dejection, was forced to what resignation he could muster. During this parleying I had been sitting alone under the umbrella, the rain falling monotonously on its vast surface, running off the glazed lid of my yellow bandbox in streams, and dripping from the brim of August's hat down his patient neck. A yard or two behind sat Gertrude on the hold all, dimly visible through the cloud of steam rising from the back of her soaked cart horse. I could hear the sea at the foot of the cliff, sluggishly heaving on and off the shingle, and I could see it over the edge of the cliff to the east and hear for the first time round the bend of the island to the north. It was flat, oily, and brown. Never was such a dreary sea or such a melancholy spot. I got out and went into the house feeling depressed. The landlord led us into a room at the back, the room in front being for the use of fishermen wishing to drink. Clouds of smoke and a great clamour smote our senses when he opened the door. The room was full of what looked like an excursion, about 30 people, male and female, sitting at narrow tables, eating, chattering, singing, and smoking, all at once. Three specially variegated young women dressed in the flimsiest of fine weather clothes, all damp muslin and feathers, pretty girls with pronounced hair arrangements, were smoking cigarettes, and in the corner near the door, demure and solitary, sat another pretty young woman in black, with a very small bonnet trimmed with a very big Alsatian bow on the back of a very elaborately curled head. Her eyes were discreetly fixed on a Wiener Schnitzel that she was eating with a singular mincingness. And all those young men who could not get near the girls in muslin were doing their utmost to attract this one's notice. "We can't stay here," I whispered to the Professor. "It is too dreadful." "Dreadful? It is humanity, little cousin, humanity at its happiest, in other words, at its dinner." And he pulled off his cloak and hung up his hat with a brisk cheerfulness at which I, who had just seen him striding about among puddles, rent with vexation, could only marvel. "But there is no room," I objected. "There is an ample sufficiency of room. We shall sit there in the corner by the young lady in black." "Well, you go and sit there, and I will go out into that porch place over there and get some air." Never did I meet any one needing so much air. Air! Hast thou not, then, been aired the entire morning? But I made my way through the smoke to a door standing open at the other end that led into a little covered place through which was the garden. I put my head gratefully round the corner to breathe the sweet air. The garden is on the west side of the lighthouse, on ground falling steeply away to the flat of the cornfields that stretch between Arkona and Puttgarten. It is a pretty place, full of lilies in flower that day, and of poplars, those most musical of trees. Rough steps, cut in the side of the hill, lead down out of the garden to a footpath through the rye to Puttgarten, and on the top step, as straight and motionless as the poplars, stood two persons under umbrellas, gazing in silence at the view. How unmistakable English backs! And most unmistakable of all backs, the backs of the Harvey Browns. I pulled my head into the porch again with a wrench, and instinctively turned to flee. But there in the corner of the room sat the Professor, and I could hear him being pleasant to the young person in the Alsatian bow. I did not choose to interrupt him, for she was obviously Mrs. Harvey Brown's maid. But I did wonder whether the Bishop had grieved at all over the manifest unregeneracy of the way she did her hair. Hesitating where to go, and sure of being ultimately caught wherever I went, I peeped again in a sort of fascination at the two mackintoshed figures outlined against the lowering heavens, and as so often happens, the persons being looked at turned round. "My dear Frau X, you here too? When did you arrive in this terrible place?" cried Mrs. Harvey Brown, hurrying towards me through the rain, with outstretched hand and face made up of welcome and commiseration. "This is too charming to meet you again. But here, imagine it, we were under the impression it was a place one could stay at, and we brought all our luggage and left our comfortable bins for good. It is impossible to be in that room. We were just considering what we could do and feeling really desperate. Bracy, is not this a charming surprise? Bracy smiled and said it was very charming, and he wished it would leave off raining. He supposed I was only driving through on my way round. Yes, I said, a thousand thoughts flying about in my head. Have you seen anything more of the neighbor lines? Asked Mrs. Harvey Brown, shutting her umbrella and preparing to come inside the porch too. My cousin left that evening, as you know, I said. Yes, I could not help wondering, began Mrs. Harvey Brown, but was interrupted by her son, who asked where I was going to sleep that night. I think at Wiek, I answered. Isn't Wiek a little place on the began Bracy, but was interrupted by his mother, who asked if the professor had followed his wife. Yes, I said. I confess I was surprised, began Mrs. Harvey Brown, but was interrupted by her son, who asked whether I thought Loame possessed an hotel where one could stay. I should think so from the look of it as I passed through, I said. Because, began Bracy, but was interrupted by his mother, who asked whether I had heard anything of the dear professor since he left. Delightful genius, she added enthusiastically. Yes, I said. I suppose he and his wife will go back to Bonn now? Soon, I hope. Did you say he had gone to Berlin? Is he there now? No, he isn't. Have you seen him again? Yes, he came back to Stubenkammer. Indeed, with his wife? No, Charlotte was not with him. Indeed? Never was a more expressive indeed. My cousin changed her plans about Berlin, I said hastily, disturbed by this expressiveness, and came back too, but she didn't care for Stubenkammer. She is waiting for me, for us, at Wiek. She is waiting there till we come. Oh, really? And the professor? The professor goes to Wiek, too, of course. Mrs. Harvey Brown gazed at me a moment, as though endeavoring to arrange her thoughts. Do forgive me, she said, for seeming stupid, but I don't quite understand where the professor is. He was at Stubenkammer, and he will be at Wiek. But where is he now? In there, I said, with a nod in the direction of the dining room, and I wished with all my heart that he wasn't. In there? Cried the bishop's wife. Prosy, do you hear? How very delightful! Let us go to him at once. And she rustled into the room, followed by Prosy and myself. You go first, dear Frau X, she turned round to say, daunted by the clouds of smoke and all the chairs and people who had to be got out of the way, for by this time the tourists had finished dining, and had pushed their chairs out into the room to talk together more conveniently, and the room was dim with smoke. You know where he is. I can't tell you how charmed I am. Really most fortunate. He seems to be with an English friend, she added, for the revellers, having paused in their din to stare at us. The professor's cheery voice was distinctly heard inquiring, in English, of some person or persons unseen, whether they knew the difference between a canary and a grand piano. Always in such genial spirits, murmured Mrs. Harvey Brown rapturously. Here there was a great abstraction, a group of people blocking the passage down the room and having to be got out of the way before we could pass. And when the scraping of their chairs and their grumbles had ceased, we caught the professor's conversation a little further on. He was saying, I cannot in that case. my dear young lady, caution you with a sufficient earnestness to be of an extreme care when purchasing a grand piano." "I don't ever think of doing such a thing," interrupted a shrill female voice, at whose sound Mrs. Harvey Brown made an exclamation. "Tut, tut! I'm putting a case. Suppose you wished to purchase a grand piano, and did not know, as you say you do not, the difference between it. I shan't wish, though. I would be a nice silly too." "Nay, but suppose you did wish. What's the good of supposing silly things like that? You are a funny old man." "Andrews," said Mrs. Harvey Brown, at this point emerging on the absorbed couple, and speaking with a languid gentleness that curled slightly upwards into an interrogation at the end. Andrews, whose face had been overspread by the expression that accompanies titters, started to her feet and froze before our eyes into the dumb passivity of the decent maid. The professor hardly gave himself time to bow and kiss Mrs. Harvey Brown's hand before he poured forth his pleasure that this charming young lady should be of her party. "Your daughter, madam, I doubt not?" "My maid," said Mrs. Harvey Brown, in a curdled kind of voice. "Andrews, please see about the luggage. She is rather a nice looking girl, I suppose," she conceded, anxious to approve of all the professor said and did. "Nice looking? She is so exceedingly pretty, madam, that I could only conclude she must be your daughter." This elementary application of balm at once soothed Mrs. Harvey Brown into a radiance of smiles, perplexing in conjunction with her age and supposed superiority to vanities. Forgetful of her objections to German crowds and smoke, she sat down in the chair vacated by Andrews, made the professor sit down again in his, and plunged into an exuberant conversation, which began by an invitation so warm that it almost seemed on fire, to visit herself and the bishop before the summer was over in the episcopal glories of Babacombe. This much I heard as I slipped away into the peace of the front room. Rosie came after me. To him the picture of the professor being wrapped about in Mrs. Harvey Brown's amenities was manifestly displeasing. The front room seemed very calm and spacious after what we had just been in. A few fishermen were drinking beer at the bar. In a corner sat Andrews and Gertrude, beginning a necessarily inarticulate acquaintance over the old owls. Both window and door were open, and the rain came down straight and steady, filling the place with a soft murmuring and dampness. Across the clearness of my first decision that the professor must be an absolutely delightful person to be always with, had crept a slight film of doubt. There were some things about him that might possibly, I began in a dim way to see, annoy a wife. He seemed to love Charlotte, and he had seemed to be very fond of me. Anyhow, never before had I been so much patted in so short a space of time. Yet the moment he caught sight of the Alsatian bow he forgot my presence and existence, forgot the fluster he had been in to get on after his wife, and attached himself to it with a vehemence that no one could be expected to like. A shadowy conviction began to pervade my mind that the sooner I handed him over to Charlotte and drove on again alone, the better. Surely Charlotte ought to go back to him and look after him. Why should I be obliged to drive round Rügen first with one Nieperlein and then with the other? The ways of fate are truly eccentric, I remarked half to myself, going to the door and gazing out into the wet. "Because they have led you to Arkona on a rainy day?" asked Rosie. "Because of that, and because of heaps of other things," I said. And sitting down at a table on which lay a bulky tome with much thumbed covers, I began rather impatiently to turn over its pages. But I had not yet reached the limits of what fate can and will do to a harmless woman who only asks to be left unnoticed. For while Brossy and I were studying this book, which is an ancient visitor's book of 1843, kept by the landlord's father or grandfather, I forget which, and quite the best thing Arkona possesses, so that I advise the traveller, whose welfare I do my best at intervals to promote, not to leave Arkona without having seen it. While, I say, we were studying this book, admiring many of its sketches, laughing over the inevitable ineptitudes that seem to drop with so surprising a facility from the pens of persons who inscribe their names, examining with awe the signatures of celebrated men who came here before they were celebrated. Bismarck's as assessor in 1843, Caprevi's as a lieutenant, Waldesee's also as lieutenant, and others of the kind. While, I repeat, we were innocently studying this book, Fate was busy tucking up her sleeves, preparing to hit me harder than ever. "It was not Fate," interrupted the wise relative before alluded to, as I sat after my return recounting my adventures and trying to extract sympathy. "It was the first consequence of your having meddled. If you had not— Well, well, the great comfort about relatives is that, though they may make what assertions they like, you need not and do not believe them. And it was Fate, and nothing but Fate, that had dodged me malevolently all round Rügen, and joined me here at Arkona once more to Mrs. Harvey Brown." In she came while we were bending over the book, followed by the professor, who walked as a man may walk in a dream, his eyes fixed on nothing, and asked me without more ado whether I would let her share my carriage as far as Wiek. "Then, you see, dear Frau X, I shall get there," she observed. "But why do you want to get there?" I asked, absolutely knocked over this time by the fists of fate. "Oh, why not? We must go somewhere, and quite the most natural thing to do is to join forces. You agree, don't you, Rosie dear? The professor thinks it an excellent plan, and is charming enough to want to relinquish his seat to me, if you will have me. Are you not, Professor? However, I only ask to be allowed to sit on the small seat, for the last thing I wish to do is to disturb anybody. But I fear the professor will not allow." And she stopped and looked with arch pleasantness at the professor, who murmured abstractedly, "Certainly, certainly," which, of course, might mean anything. "My dear mother," began Rosie in a tone of strong remonstrance. "How, I'm sure it is the best thing we can do, Rosie. I did ask the landlord about hiring a fly, and there is no such thing. I will only be as far as Wiek, and I hear that is not so very far. You don't mind, do you, dear Frau X?" "Mind?" I cried, wriggling out a smile. "Mind? But how will your son I don't quite see. And your maid?" "Oh, Brossy has his bicycle, and if you will let the luggage be put in your luggage cart, Andrews can quite well sit beside your maid. Of course, we will share expenses, so that it will really be mutually advantageous." Mrs. Harvey Brown being one of those few persons who know exactly what they want, did as she chose with wavering creatures like myself. She also did as she chose with Brose, because the impossibility of publicly rebuking one's mother shut his mouth. She even did as she chose with the professor, who, declaring that sooner than incommode the ladies he would go in the luggage cart, was in the very act, as we were preparing to start off, of nimbly climbing onto the trunk next to the one on which Andrew sat, when he found himself hesitating, coming down again, getting into the victoria, subsiding on to the little seat, and all in obedience to a clear something in the voice of Mrs. Harvey Brown. Never did unhappy celebrity sit more wretchedly than the poor professor. It was raining so hard that we were obliged to have the hood up, and its edge came to within an inch of his nose. Would have touched it quite if he had not sat as straight and as far back as possible. He could not, therefore, put up his umbrella, and was reduced, while water trickled ceaselessly off the hood down his neck, to pretending with great heroism that he was perfectly comfortable. It was impossible to sit under the snug hood and contemplate the drenched professor outside it. It was impossible to let an old man of 70, and an old man besides of such immense European value, catch his death before my very eyes. Either he must come between us, and be what is known as bodkin, or some one must get out and walk. And the bodkin solution not commending itself to me, it was plain that if some one walked it must be myself. In an instant the carriage was stopped. Protestations filled the air. I got out. The professor was transferred to my place. The bishop's wife turned deaf ears to his entreaties that he might go in the luggage cart and hold his big umbrella over the two poor drowning maids. The hood became vocal with arguments, suggestions, expostulations, apologies, and "Go on, August," I interrupted, and dropped behind into sand and silence. We were already beyond Puttgarten, in a flat, uninteresting country of deep sand and treeless, hedgeless cornfields. I had no umbrella, but a cloak with a hood to it, which I drew over my head, throwing Gertrude my hat, when she too presently heaved past in a cloud of expostulations. "Go on, go on!" I called to the driver with a wave of my hand, seeing him hesitate, and then stood waiting for Brose, who was some little way behind pushing his bicycle dismally through the sand, meditating, no doubt, on the immense difficulties of dealing with mothers who do things one does not like. When he realized that the solitary figure with the peaked hood, outlined against the sullen grey background, was mine, he pushed along at a trot, with a face of great distress. But I had no difficulty in looking happy and assuring him that I liked walking, because I really was thankful to get away from the bishop's wife. And I rather liked, besides, to be able to stretch myself thoroughly, while, as for getting wet, to let oneself slowly be soaked to the skin while walking in a warm rain has a charm all its own. Accordingly, after the preliminary explanations, we plodded along comfortably enough towards Wiek, keeping the carriage in sight as much as possible, and talking about all the things that interested Brose, which were mostly things of great obscurity to myself. I suppose he thought it safest to keep to high truths and generalities, fearing lest the conversation, in dropping to an everyday level, should also drop on to the Nibelines, and he seemed quite anxious not to know why Charlotte was at Wiek by herself while her husband and I were driving together without her. Therefore he soared carefully in realms of pure reason, and I, silent and respectful, watched him from below, only I could not help comparing the exalted vagueness of his talk with the sharp clearness of all that the old and wise professor said. Wiek, after all, turned out to be hardly more than 5 miles from Arkona, but it was heavy going. What with the bicycle, and my wet skirts, and the high talk, we got along slowly, and my soul grew more chilled with every step by the thought of the complications the presence of the Harvey Browns was going to make in the delicate task of persuading Charlotte to return to her husband. Rose knew very well that there was something unusual in the Nibelline relations, and was plainly uneasy at being thrust into a family meeting. When the red roofs and poplars of Wiek came in sight he sank into thoughtfulness, and we walked the last mile in our heavy sand-caked shoes in almost total silence. The carriage and cart had disappeared long ago, urged on, no doubt, by the professor's eagerness to get to Charlotte and away from Mrs. Harvey Brown, and we were quite near the first cottages when August appeared coming back to fetch us, driving very fast, with Gertrude's face peering anxiously round the hood. It was only a few yards from there to the open space in the middle of the village in which the two inns are, and Prossy got on his bicycle while I drove with Gertrude, wrapped in all the rugs she could muster. There are two inns at Wiek, and one is the best. The professor had gone to each to inquire for his wife, and I found him striding about in front of the one that is the best, and I saw at once by the very hang of his cloak and position of his hat that Charlotte was not there. "Gone, gone!" he cried before the carriage stopped even. "Gone this very day, this very morning, gone at 8, at the selfsame hour we wasted over those accursed flounders. Is it not sufficient to make a poor husband become mad, after months of patience? To miss her everywhere by a few miserable hours? I told thee, I begged thee, to bring me on last night." Prossy, now of a quiet, deadly anxiety to keep out of neighbourline complications, removed himself and his bicycle with all possible speed. Mrs. Harvey Brown, watching my arrival from an upper window, waved a genial hand with ill-timed cordiality whenever I looked her way. The landlord and his wife carried in all the rugs that dropped off me unheeded into the mud when I got out, and did not visibly turn a hair at my peaked hood and draggled garments. "Where has she gone?" I asked as soon as I could get the professor to keep still and listen. "We will drive after her the first thing tomorrow morning. Tonight, if you like." "Drive after her?" Last night, when it would have availed, thou wouldest not drive after her. Now, if we follow her, we must swim. She has gone to an island, I tell thee, of which I never till this day heard. An island to reach which requires much wind from a favourable quarter, which without wind is not to be reached at all. And in me thou now beholdest a broken hearted man." End of section 13.
Chapter 14 of The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen by Elizabeth von Arnim. The 10th day, from Wiek to Hiddensee. The island to which Charlotte had retired was the island of Hiddensee, a narrow strip of sand to the west of Rügen. Generally so wordy, the guidebook merely mentions it as a place to which it is possible for Rügen tourists to make excursions, and proffers with a certain timidity the information that pleasure may be had there in observing the life and habits of sea-birds. To this place of sea-birds Charlotte had gone, as she wrote in a letter left with the landlady for me, because during the night she spent at Wiek, a panic had seized her lest the Harvey Browns should by some chance appear there in their wanderings before I did. "I dare say they will not dream of coming round this way at all," she continued, "but you never know." "You certainly never know," I agreed, Mrs. Harvey Brown being at that very moment in the room Charlotte had had the panic in, and I lay awake elaborating a most beautiful plan by which I intended at one stroke to reunite Charlotte and her husband and free myself of both of them. This plan came into my head during the evening while sitting sadly listening to something extremely like a scolding from the professor. It seemed to me that I had done all in my power short of inhumanity to the horses to help him, and it was surely not my fault that Charlotte had not happened to stay anywhere long enough for us to catch her up. My intentions were so good, far preferring to drive alone and stop where and when I pleased, at Witt, for instance, among the walnut trees. I had yet given up all my preferences so that I might help bring man and wife together. If anything, did not this conduct incline towards the noble? "Your extreme simplicity amazes me," remarked the wise relative, when, arrived at this part of my story on my return home, I plaintively asked the above question. "Under no circumstances is the meddler ever thanked." "Meddler? Helper, you mean? Apparently you would call every person who helps a meddler?" "Armes Kind. Proceed with the story." Well, the professor, who had suffered much in the hood between Arkona and Wiek, was more irritated by his disappointment on getting to Wiek than seemed consistent with the supposed serenity of the truly wise, was telling me for the 10th time that if I had brought him on at once from Glowe, as he had begged me to do, we would not only have escaped the Harvey Browns, but would have caught his Charlotte by now, seeing that she had not left Wiek for Hiddensee until 8 o'clock of this Saturday we had now got to, and I was drooping more and more under these reproaches when, with the suddenness of inspiration, the beautiful plan flooded my dejected brain with such a cheerful light that I lifted my head and laughed in the professor's face. "Now, pray tell me," he exclaimed, stopping short in his strides about the room, "what thou seest to laugh at in my present condition?" "Nothing in your present condition. It's the glories of your future one that made me laugh." "Surely that is not a subject on which one laughs, nor will I discuss it with a woman, nor is this the place or the moment. I refer thee," and he swept round his arm as though to sweep me altogether out of sight, "I refer thee to thy pastor. Dearest professor, don't be so dreadfully cross. The future state I was thinking of isn't further off than tomorrow. Sometimes there's a cunning about a woman's wit that you great artists in profundity don't possess. You can't, of course, because you are so busy being wise on a large scale, but it's quite useful to have some cunning when you have to work out petty schemes, and I tell you solemnly that at this moment I am full of it." He stopped again in his striding. The good landlady and her one handmaiden were laying the table for supper. Mrs. Harvey Brown had gone upstairs to put on those evening robes in which it appeared she had nightly astonished the ignorant tourists of Rügen. Rosie had not been seen at all since our arrival. "What thou art full of!" is nothing but poking of fun at me, I fear," said the professor, but his kind old face began to smooth out a little. "I'm not. I'm only full of artfulness, and anxious to put it all at your disposal. But you mustn't be quite so cross. Pray, am I no longer then your dear and little cousin? When thou art good, yes. Whom to pat is pleasant? Yes, yes, it is pleasant, but if unreasonableness develops. And with whom to sit under one umbrella is a joy? Surely, surely, but thou hast been of a great obstinacy. Well, come and sit here and let us be happy. We're very comfortable here, aren't we? Don't let us think any more about the wet, horrid, obstinate, disappointing day we've had. And as for tomorrow, I've got a plan." The professor, who had begun to calm, sat down beside me on the sofa. The landlord, deft and noiseless, was giving a finishing touch of roses and fruit and candles to the supper table. He had been a butler in a good family, and was of the most beautiful dignity and solemnity. We were sitting in a very queer old room, used in past years for balls to which the quality drove in from their distant estates and danced through winter nights. There was a gallery for the fiddlers, and the chairs and benches ranged round the walls were still covered with a festive-looking faded red stuff. In the middle of this room the landlord had put a table for us to sup at, and had arranged it in a way I had not seen since leaving home. No one else was in the house but ourselves. No one, hardly of the tourist class, comes to Wiek, and yet, or because of it, this inn of all the inns I had stayed at was in every way quite excellent. "Tell me then thy plan, little one," said the professor, settling himself comfortably into the sofa corner. "Oh, it's quite simple. You and I tomorrow morning will go to Hiddensee." "Go? Yes, but how? It is Sunday, and even if it were not, no steamers seem to go to what appears to be a spot of great desolation. We'll hire a fishing smack. And, if there is no wind, we'll pray for wind. And I shall spend an entire day within the cramped limits of a vessel in the company of the English female bishop. I tell thee, it is not to be accomplished." "No, no, of course they mustn't come too." "Come? She will come if she wishes to. Never did I meet a more commanding woman." "No, no, we must circumvent the Harvey Browns." "Do thou stay here then and circumvent. Then shall I proceed in safety on my way." "Oh, no," I exclaimed in some consternation. The success of my plan, which was by no means to be explained in its entirety to the professor, wholly depended on my going too. I want to see Charlotte again. You know I'm fond of Charlotte. And besides, long before you got to Hiddensee, you would have sunk into another abstraction and begun to fish or something, and you'd come back here in the evening with no Charlotte and only fishes." Well do I now know what is the object I have in view. Don't be so proud. Remember Pilatus. "Thou art beginning to be like a conscience to me," rebuking and urging onwards the poor old man in bewildering alternations. "But I tell thee there is no hope of setting sail without the English madam unless thou remainest here while I secretly slip away." "I won't remain here. I'm coming too. Leave the arrangements to me, dearest professor, and you'll see we'll secretly slip away together." Mrs. Harvey Brown, sweeping in at that moment in impressive garments that trailed, our conversation had to end abruptly. The landlord lit the candles, the landlady brought in the soup, Rosie appeared, dressed as one dresses in civilized regions. "Cheer up," I whispered to the professor as I got up from the sofa, and he cheered up so immediately, and so excessively, that before I could stop him, before I could realize what he was going to do, he had actually chucked me under the chin. We spent a constrained evening. The one remark Mrs. Harvey Brown addressed to me during the hours that followed this chin-chucking was, "I am altogether at a loss to understand Frau Nieberlein's having retired without her husband to yet another island. why this regrettable multiplicity of islands? To which I could only answer that I did not know. The next day, being Sunday, a small boy went up into the wooden belfry of the church, which was just opposite my window, and began to toll 2 bells. The belfry is built separate from the church, and commands a view into the room of the inn that was my bedroom. I could see the small boy walking leisurely from bell to bell, giving each a pull, and then refreshing himself by leaning out and staring hard at me. I got my opera glasses and examined him with equal care, trying to stare him out of countenance. But though small, he was also a bold boy, and not to be abashed, and as I would not give in either, we stared at each other steadily between the tolls till 9 o'clock, when the bell ringing ceased, service began, and he reluctantly went down into the church, where I suppose he had to join in the singing of the tune to which in England the hymn beginning "All glory, laud, and honour" is sung, for it presently floated out into the quiet little market-place, filling it with the feeling of Sunday. While I lingered at the window listening to this, I saw Mrs. Harvey Brown emerge from the inn door in her Sunday toque, and crossing the market-place, followed by Brosie, go into the church. In an instant I had whisked into my hat, and hurrying downstairs to the Professor, who was strolling up and down a rose-bordered path in the garden at the back of the house, informed him breathlessly that the Harvey Browns might now be looked upon as circumvented. "What, already? Thou art truly a wonderful ally," he exclaimed in great glee. "Oh, that's nothing," I replied modestly, as indeed it was. "Let us start at once, then," he cried briskly, and we accordingly started, slipping out of the house and round the corner down to the quay. The sun was shining, the ground was drying, there was a slight breeze from the east, which ought, the landlord said, to blow us gently to Hiddensee, if it kept up in about 4 hours. All my arrangements had been made the night before with the aid of August and Gertrude, and the brig Bertha, quite an imposing-looking craft that plied on weekdays, weather permitting, between Wiek and Stralsund, had been hired for the day at a cost of 15 marks, including a skipper with one eye, and 4 able seamen. The brig Bertha seemed to me very cheap. She was to be at my disposal from dawn till as far into the night as I wanted her. All the time the bellboy and I were exchanging increasingly sarcastic stares, she was lying at the quay, ready to start at any moment. She had been chartered in my name, and for that one day she, her skipper, and her 4 able seamen belonged entirely to me. Gertrude was waiting on board, and had arranged a sort of nest of rugs and cushions for me. The landlady and her servant were also there, with a basket of home-made cakes and cherries out of the inn garden. This landlady, by the way, was quite ideal. Her one aim seemed to be to do things like baking cakes for her visitors and not putting them in the bill. I met nothing else at all like her or her husband on my journey round Rügen or anywhere else. Their simple kindness shall not go unsung, and therefore do I pause here, with one foot on the quay and the other on the brig Bertha, to sing it. But indeed the traveller who does not yearn for waiters, and has no prejudices against crawling up a staircase so steep that it is practically a ladder when he wants to go to bed, who loves quiet, is not insensible to the charms of good cooking, and thinks bathing and sailing agreeable pastimes, could be extremely happy at a very small cost at Wiek. And when all other pleasures are exhausted, he can hire the Bertha and go to Hiddensee and study seabirds. "Thou takest the excellent but unprepossessing Gertrude with thee?" inquired the Professor in a slightly displeased voice, seeing her immovable and the sails being hoisted. "Yes, I don't like being sick without her." "Sick? There will hardly be a sufficiency of wind for the needs of the vessel. How wilt thou be sick in a calm?" "How can I tell till I have tried?" Oh, gay voyage down the Wieker Bodden, over the little dancing waves, under the serene summer sky. Oh, blessed change from the creaking of a carriage through dust to rippling silence and freshness. The Professor was in such spirits that he could hardly be kept from doing what he called manning the yards, and had to be fetched down when he began to clamber by the alarmed skipper. Gertrude sat watching for the first glimpse of our destination with the intentness of a second Brangäne. The wind could hardly be said to blow us along, it was so very gentle, but it did waft us along smoothly and steadily, and Wiek slipped into distance and its bells into silence, and the occasional solitary farms on the flat shores slid away one after the other, and the farthest point ahead came to meet us, dropped astern, became the farthest point behind, and we were far on our way, while we were thinking we could hardly be moving. The reader who looks at the map will see the course we took, and how with that gentle wind it came to be nearly 12 before we rounded the corner of the Wieke Bodden, passed a sandbank crowded with hundreds of seagulls, and headed for the northern end of Hiddensee. Hiddensee lay stretched out from north to south, long and narrow, like a lizard lying in the sun. It is absolutely flat, a mere sandbank, except at the northern end where it swells up into hills and a lighthouse. There are only 2 villages on it with inns, the one called Witte, built on a strip of sand so low, so level with the sea that it looks as if an extra big wave, or indeed any wave, must wash right over it and clean it off the face of the earth, and the other called Klooster, where Charlotte was. I observe that on the map Klooster is printed in large letters, as though it were a place of some importance. It is a very pretty, very small handful of fishermen's cottages, one little line of them in a green nest of rushes and willows along the water's edge, with a hill at the back, and some way up the hill a small dilapidated church, forlorn and spireless in a churchyard bare of trees. We dropped anchor in the glassy bay about 2 o'clock. The last bit of the Witte Bodden having been slow, almost windless work, and were rowed ashore in a dinghy, there not being enough water within 100 yards to float so majestic a craft as the Bertha. The skipper leaned over the side of his brig, watching us go and wishing us viel vergnügen. The dinghy and the 2 rowers were to wait at the little landing stage till such time as we should want them again. Gertrude came with us, carrying the landlady's basket of food. "Once more thou takest the excellent but unprepossessing Gertrude with thee?" inquired the professor with increased displeasure. "Yes, to carry the cakes." And he muttered something that sounded irritable about the liebe Gott having strewn the world with so many plain women. "This isn't the time to bother about plain women," I said. "Don't you feel in every fibre that you are within a stone's throw of your Charlotte? I am sure we've caught her this time." For a moment he had forgotten Charlotte, and all his face grew radiant at the reminder. With the alacrity of 18 he leapt ashore, and we hurried along a narrow, rushy path at the water's edge to the one inn, a small cottage of the simplest sort, overlooking green fields and placid water. A trim servant in Sunday raiment was clearing away coffee cups from a table in the tiny front garden, and of her we asked with some trembling after our many disappointments whether Frau Nieberlein were there. Yes, she was staying there, but had gone up on to the downs after dinner. In what direction? Past the church up the lighthouse way. The professor darted off before she had done. I hastened after him. Gertrude waited at the inn. With my own eyes I wished to see that he actually did meet Charlotte, for the least thing would make him forget what he had come for, and so nimble was he, so winged with love, that I had to make desperate and panting efforts to get up to the top of the hill as soon as he did. Up we sped in silence, past the bleak churchyard, on to what turned out to be the most glorious downs. On the top the professor stopped a moment to wipe his forehead, and looking back for the first time, I was absolutely startled by the loveliness of the view. The shining Bodden with its bays and little islands lay beneath us. To the north was the sea, to the west the sea, to the east right away on the other side of distant Rügen, the sea. Far in the south rose the towers of Stralsund. Close behind us a forest of young pines filled the air with warm waves of fragrance. At our feet the turf was thick with flowers. O wide and splendid world! How good it is to look sometimes across great spaces, to lift one's eyes from narrowness, to feel the large silence that rests on lonely hills. Motionless we stood before this sudden unrolling of the beauty of God's earth. The place seemed full of a serene and mighty presence. Far up, near the clouds, a solitary lark was singing its joys. There was no other sound. I believe if I had not been with him, the professor would again have forgotten Charlotte, and lying down on the flowery turf with his eyes on that most beautiful of views, have given himself over to abstractions. But I stopped him at the very moment when he was preparing to sink to the ground. "No, no," I besought. "Don't sit down." "Not sit? And why, then, shall not a warm old man sit?" "First let us find Charlotte." At the bare mention of the name he began to run. The inn servant had said Charlotte had gone up to the lighthouse. From where we were we could not see it, but hurrying through a corner of the pine wood, we came out on the north end of Hiddensee, and there it was on the edge of the cliff. Then my heart began to beat with mingled feelings: exultation that I should be on the verge of doing so much good, fear lest my plan by some fatal mishap should be spoiled, or, if it succeeded, my actions be misjudged. "Wait a moment," I murmured faintly, laying a trembling hand on the professor's arm. "Dear professor, wait a moment. Charlotte must be quite close now. I don't want to intrude on you both at first, so please will you give her this letter?" And I pulled it with great difficulty, it being fat and my fingers shaky, out of my pocket, the eloquent letter I had written in the dawn at Stubbenkammer, and pressed it into his hand. "Give it to her with my love, with my very dear love." "Yes, yes," said the professor, impatient of these speeches, and only desirous of getting on. He crushed the letter unquestioningly into his pocket, and we resumed our hurried walking. The footpath led us across a flowery slope ending in a cliff that dropped down on the sunset side of the island to the sea. We had not gone many yards before we saw a single figure sitting on this slope, its back to us, its slightly dejected head and shoulders appearing above the crowd of wildflowers, scabious, harebells, and cow parsley, through whose frail loveliness flashed the shimmering sea. It was Charlotte. I seized the professor's hand. "Look, there she is," I whispered in great excitement, holding him back for one instant. "Give me time to get out of sight. Don't forget the letter. Let me get into the wood first, and then go to her. Now, all blessings be with thee, dearest professor. Good luck to you both. You'll see how happy you both are going to be." And wringing his hand with a fervor that evidently surprised him, I turned and fled. Oh, how I fled! Never have I run so fast, with such a nightmare feeling of covering no ground. Back through the wood, out on the other side, straight as an arrow down the hill towards the Bodden, taking the shortest cut over the turf to Closter. Oh, how I ran! It makes me breathless now to think of it. As if pursued by demons I ran, not daring to look back, not daring to stop and gasp. Away I flew. Past the church, past the parson, who, I remember, stared at me aghast over his garden wall, past the willows, past the rushes, down to the landing stage and Gertrude. Everything was ready. I had given the strictest private instructions, and dropping speechless into the dinghy, a palpitating mixture of heat, anxiety, and rapture, was rowed away as fast as two strong men could row me to the brig and the waiting skipper. The wind was terribly light, the water terribly glassy. At first I lay in a quivering heap on the cushions, hardly daring to think we were not moving, hardly daring to remember how I had seen a small boat tied to a stake in front of the inn, and that if the Bertha did not get away soon. Then fortune smiled on the doer of good. A gentle puff filled the sails. There was a distinct rippling across the bows. It increased to a gurgle, and Closter, with its willows, its downs, its one inn, and its impossibility of being got out of, silently withdrew into shadows. Then did I stretch myself out on my rugs with a deep sigh of relief, and allow Gertrude to fuss over me. Never have I felt so nice, so kind, so exactly like a ministering angel. How grateful the dear old professor would be! And Charlotte, too, when she had read my letter and listened to all he had to say, she would have to listen. She wouldn't be able to help herself, and there would be heaps of time. I laughed aloud for joy at the success of my plan. There they were on that tiny island, and there they would have to stay, at least until tomorrow, probably longer. Perhaps they would get so fond of it that they would stay on there indefinitely. Anyhow, I had certainly reunited them and freed myself. Emphatically, this was one of those good actions that blesses him who acts and him who is acted upon, and never did well-doer glow with a warmer consciousness of having done well than I glowed as I lay on the deck of the Bertha, watching the seagulls in great comfort, and eating not only my own cherries, but the professor's as well. All the way up the Wieker Bodden we had to tack. Hour after hour we tacked, and seemed to get no nearer home. The afternoon wore on, the evening came, and still we tacked. The sun set gloriously, the moon came up, the sea was a deep violet, the clouds in the eastern sky about the moon shone with a pearly whiteness, the clouds in the west were gorgeous past belief, flaming across in marvellous colours even to us, the light reflected from them transfiguring our sails, our men, our whole boat into a spirit ship of an unearthly radiance, bound for Elysium, manned by immortal gods. Look now how colour, the soul's bridegroom, makes the house of heaven splendid for the bride. I quoted, awestruck, watching this vast plain of light with clasped hands and rapt spirit. It was a solemn and magnificent close to my journey. End of section 14, read by Sandra.
Section number 15 of The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen by Elizabeth von Arnim. The 11th day. From Wiek, home. The traveller in whose interests I began this book, and who has so frequently been forgotten during the writing of it, might very well protest here that I have not yet been all around Rügen, and should not therefore talk of closes to my journey. But nothing that the traveller can say will keep me from going home in this chapter. I did go home on the morning of the 11th day, driving from Wiek to Bergen and taking the train from there. And the red line on the map will show that, except for one dull corner in the southeast, I had practically carried out my original plan and really had driven all round the island. Reaching the inn at Wiek at 10 o'clock on the Sunday night, I went straight and very softly to bed, and leaving the inn at Wiek at 8 o'clock on the Monday morning, I might have got away without ever seeing Mrs. Harvey Brown again, if the remembrance of Brosie's unvarying kindness had not stirred me to send Gertrude up with a farewell message. Mrs. Harvey Brown, having heard all about my day on the Bertha from the landlady, and how I had come back in the unimpeachability of singleness, the professor safely handed over to his wife, forgave the chin-chucking, forgave the secret setting out, and hurried on to the landing in a wrapper, warmth in her heart and honey on her lips. "What, are you leaving us, dear Frau X?" she called over the baluster. "So early? So suddenly? I can't come down to you. Do come up here. Why didn't you tell me you were going today?" she continued, when I'd come up, holding my hand in both hers, speaking with emphatic cordiality, an altogether melted and mellifluous bishop's wife. "I hadn't quite decided. I fear I must go home today. They want me badly." "That I can quite understand. Of course they want their little ray of sunshine," she cried, growing more and more mellifluous. "Now tell me," she went on, stroking the hand she held, "when are you coming to see us all at Babbacombe?" Babbacombe? Heavens, when indeed? Never, 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 shrieked my soul. "Oh, thanks," murmured my lips. "How kind you are, but do you think the bishop would like me?" "The bishop? He would more than like you, dear Frau X. He would positively glory in you." glory in me, I faintly gasped, and a gaudy vision of the bishop glorying, that bishop of whom I had been taught to think as steeped in chronic sorrow, swam before my dazzled eyes. How kind you are, but I'm afraid you are too kind. I'm afraid he would soon see there wasn't anything to make him glory, and much to make him grieve. Well, we mustn't be so modest. Of course the bishop knows we are all human, and so must have our little faults. But I can assure you he would be delighted to make your acquaintance. He is a most large-minded man. Now promise. I murmured confused thanks and tried to draw my hand away, but it was held tight. I shall miss the midday train at Bergen if I don't go at once, I appealed. I really must go. You long to be with all your dear ones again, I'm sure. If I don't catch this train, I shall not get home tonight. I really must go. Home. How charming your home must be. One hears so much about the charming German home life, but unfortunately, just traveling through the country, one gets no chance of a peep into it. Yes, I've felt that myself in other countries. Goodbye, I absolutely must run. Goodbye! And tearing my hand away with the energy of panic, I got down the ladder as quickly as I could without actually sliding, for I knew that in another moment the bishop's wife would have invited herself. Ugh, it did not bear thinking of. And the Neighborlanes? She called over the baluster, suddenly remembering them. They're on an island, quite inaccessible in this wind, a mere desert, only seabirds, and one is sick getting to it. Goodbye! But do they not return here? She called still louder, for I was through the door now and out on the path. No, Stralsund, Berlin, Bonn, goodbye! The landlord and his wife were waiting outside, the landlady with a great bunch of roses and yet another basket of cakes. Rosie was there too and helped me into the carriage. I'm frightfully sorry you're going, he said. So am I, but one must ultimately go. Observe the eternal truth lurking in that sentence. If ever you are wandering about Germany alone, do come and see us. I should love to. And thus, with mutual amenities, Rosie and I parted. So ended my journey around Rügen, for there is nothing to be recorded of that last drive to the railway station at Bergen, except that it was flat, and we saw the Jagdschloss in the distance. At the station, I bid farewell to the carriage in which I had sometimes suffered and often been happy, for August stayed that night in Bergen and brought the horses home next day. And presently the train appeared and swept up Gertrude and myself, and Rügen knew us no more. But before I part from the traveller, who ought by this time to be very tired, I will present him with the following condensed experiences. The nicest bathing was at Lauterbach. The best inn was at Wiek. I was happiest at Lauterbach and Wiek. I was most wretched at Gören. The cheapest place was Thiesow. The dearest place was Stubenkammer. The most beautiful place was Hiddensee. And perhaps he might like to know too, though it really is no business of his, what became of the Neighborlands. I am sorry to say that I had letters from them both of a nature that positively prohibits publication, and a mutual acquaintance told me that Charlotte had applied for a judicial separation. When I heard it, I was thunderstruck. The end. End of section number 15. End of The Adventures of Elizabeth in Rügen by Elizabeth von Arnim.